Good morning and welcome to a very special interview show of the Prode. Today's discussion focuses on a critical policy challenge facing Europe: how to defend and renew the European democratic project at a time when authoritarian tendencies are re emerging, social divisions are intensifying, and public trust in institutions is under increasing strain. Across the continent, long standing commitments to human rights, the rule of law, and social cohesion are being tested. The central question is not only how European democracies should respond to these pressures, but how they can do so while remaining firmly anchored in their core values. To examine these issues, I'm honored to be joined by Honourable Kinga Göncz, a guest whose career spans senior public office, European governance, academia, and civil society. She has served as Hungary's Minister of Foreign Affairs, represented Hungary in the European Parliament with a strong focus on civil liberties and human rights, and contributed extensively to public debates on democracy, social inclusion, and public governance at both European and global level. Her experience offers a rare perspective on how democratic principles are translated into policy and practice. Thank you so much, ma'am, for your time. We truly appreciate you being here with us today.
Thank you for this wonderful introduction. It is really interesting to see yourself from outside. I think it is not so excellent, but it is more or less a comprehensive type of introduction. Okay, let's start.
Ma'am, I would like to begin the discussion by asking that how can the European Union meaningfully strengthen democratic resilience at a time when authoritarian tendencies are emerging not only beyond Europe's border, but increasingly within some of its own member states?
I think it's a really difficult question, because if we look around, and the situation is very much different than, let's say, just 1 year ago, when we had the impression or illusion that EU and the US are somehow together, representing the same values and civilization type of advancements. Now we see that the US returned back, and under the presidency of Donald Trump, it really fall out from this network. So it is more or less the EU, which is, I'm not saying that alone, because we see more and more new members of this alliance, not as members of the EU, but for example Canada, which is very much and very strongly representing the same values, and which is one of the possible future partners for the EU. But it's a reshuffling of the whole global world in that sense. So I think what the EU can do, it is really, in one hand, which would be very important, to stand up for these values inside of the EU framework. And in that sense, I think Hungary is one of the weakest point or weakest part of the chain, because Viktor Orban was the first, and almost the first, inside of the EU, undermining these democratic values. And I was sitting in, as you mentioned, that I was in the European Parliament. I was sitting in the European Parliament in 2010, when Orban's second term started, but it is still lasting more than 15 years. And we started to say that it is very dangerous what Orban is introducing. They started with the media law, they started with the change of the fundamental law, and so on. And the EU and even the European Parliament was really helpless and could not do anything. I think people started to understand the real danger and the real risk with these issues, but still, it is still not ready. The EU is still not ready to fight against this type of authoritarian tendency inside of the EU, and therefore you also mentioned this division or polarization. We see more and more polarization also inside of the EU. So I think it would be very important to be very clear inside of the framework and stand up and saying that there are certain values which cannot be questioned. The Article 7 is still not used against Hungary, and Hungary is not alone, but it's also quite dangerous that they are more and more these extreme right or populist parties inside of the EU, also in the much bigger member states. Hungary is a small member state, cannot really make this decisive stand. But if in France, in Germany, AFD or the Front National will be in the governmental position, I think this is really undermining the EU values and the democracy inside of the EU. So I think it would be very important to stand up, to make it also clear for the people who are voting, basically, for these parties, that it is not just one single vote, but it is really a kind of turning point for the EU, whether it can stay on the democratic side or it can turn to the same direction as the US in the last years. So I think it is very important for the people who are having in their hand basically the decisive power to understand that there is a real turning point. And all of the single votes are counting in the next national elections, because it is somehow the ground of future democracy in the EU.
Yeah. So, drawing on your experience, how can the EU more effectively defend human rights and the rule of law while avoiding the unintended consequences of political polarization or the perception of external imposition that often fuels anti-European sentiment?
There were some initiatives also inside of the EU, somehow involving or mobilizing people more to understand the European level democracy. There is a fundamental structural problem that people are voting for the national governments. Also, the national governments are serving the people and the sentiment in the public. And it is not always helpful in terms of strengthening the integration of the EU. I really think that what would be very important to somehow to deepen the EU integration. It also would mean that the EU values human rights, rule of law, democracy, and all of these uh, would be more present in all of the member states. The problem is that because the national elections are in different times, uh, the EU is always waiting for the next national election in one of the countries. It means that all of the decisions are very slow, and because there are always some governments which are not in favor of the deeper integration, there are always some governments which are stepping back. Uh, uh, it is a step which cannot be done in this structure. I can imagine that because there is a real pressure now on the EU, losing the United States, having a much sharper, uh, let's say, fight in the global sphere. I can imagine that it will somehow help the EU and also the member states realizing that unless they have a deeper integration, they are much weaker when they have to stand up for their values uh, against the US, against China. And I really hope that this type of, we always say that the EU is developing throughout crisis. And it is true that the basically democracy is always in crisis. But because of the democratic procedures, there are always a hope that the crisis can bring up new developments because there is a kind of feedback. People understand more the situation. So I really hope that this crisis, which is a real one, can help the EU to clarify which are the most important values and which are the future developments really strengthen the EU. Also, in that sense, this civilization and democracy from the civilization and democracy aspects.
Yeah, you talked about external factors. We are seeing Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, and on the other hand, we are also seeing the tensions and transatlantic relations between United States and European Union and other European countries on Greenland. and there is an increasing threat from rising China. So how would you take all these three factors into picture when trying to decode the European foreign policy?
Again, the problem with the European foreign policy that there is no unified foreign policy. It is always based on the decision of the foreign ministers and the prime ministers. Uh, and I think it goes back what I previously said, that unless the EU can realize that they have to be much more unified, uh, deepening the integration also in the field of foreign policy, I don't think that Europe can play an important role in this global fight or global scene. So I think structural changes are extremely important.
Yeah. So to what?
I am really sorry. It is clear that Europe should be very clear in terms of Ukraine, and very, very clear that Russia is the aggressor, because it's somehow also blurred this. Because again, what we see globally, it is a kind of turn where those who are big enough, strong enough, militarily, economically, and so on, they have the right to do whatever they want, and it is very much against the previous time, which was built up after World War II, which was based on international law, and basically it was mandatory for all of the countries accepting this international law. Now what we see, that it is really the strength of the country which is decisive, and in that sense, unless EU is strong enough and can somehow show this type of strength, again, it should become a military power, and in this moment, it relied much more on the United States than on its own strengths. Economically, it is much stronger, but I think it is also important with more integration, having more strengths. So I think in this world, unless Europe can be really strong enough and unified enough, it cannot be an important player.
Yeah. So, how should the European Union navigate the tension between respect for national sovereignty and its collective responsibility to uphold democratic norms, legal accountability, and the rule of law across the Union?
Uh, it is the difficult thing, because deepening the integration needs unanimity. It is absolutely clear. Uh, but because there are some member states which are using the term of sovereignty, which is basically, in the case of Orban Viktor, is undermining the unified European position in many situations, including Russia and the Ukrainian world. Which is not sovereignty, basically. It is much more about his own uh, power, and it is not really about the country, but it is all the same, because he also has a seat around the table and has the right to undermine certain decisions. So I think the whole EU was based on the voluntary decision of the member states that they are somehow delegating part of their sovereignty to the EU level, because they realized that somehow it is helping them uh, if they do something on a unified way and together. So it is no controversy in that sense between sovereignty and unification, or the EU concept, because it was a voluntary process. The problem is that now it's very difficult to make the next steps, having all of the member states on board, and it
Yeah.
is what the EU is struggling with.
Yeah. And so, in the era which is defined by geopolitical instability, hybrid threats, and security concerns, how can Europe respond decisively to internal and external challenges without eroding civil liberties and democratic freedoms that the states have?
Uh, I think the real question is not. I would not formulate on that way. I think the military preparation EU in this world where really where the different powers are fighting with each other. I think it's very important not to rely on the United States in the framework of NATO, but somehow having a very strong military power also inside of the EU. The problem is not so much civil liberties. The problem is that EU is in one hand very proud of, but also people are get used to this the so-called welfare states, meaning that there's a redistribution of income on the state level, and people used to have a very good healthcare system, a social system, somehow a good educational system, and so on, which costs money basically. And I think if the EU has to increase the investment in military preparedness, let's say, it means that this money should come from somewhere, and people have to understand that in this new framework, they have to also sacrifice something because there is no more money. And I think it is a very sensitive issue inside of the EU. It is something where, because many people are not, do not care so much about civil liberties, do not care so much about rule of law. They do not understand why is it important for them. But they really see it is if they have this kind of security, social security, and welfare state, and if there is a cut on this welfare state, it is strengthening very much the extreme right in the individual countries. And my fear is that if there is a pressure from that side to spend more on the military preparedness, it means that people have to sacrifice something. Then it will again weaken let's say the support for the EU and the EU integration, and it will strengthen the extreme right parties, which are speaking about again sovereignty, which is not really sovereignty, which is much more about all of the consequences what we see in many countries as the consequence of these extreme right movements. So I think it's a very sensitive balance in this moment.
Yeah.
Many people see the need for this type of developments, but I think the local governments, the national governments have also a fear that in this process they can lose power.
Yeah.
And as a consequence, also the EU.
Yeah, now coming to the action part of it. So, what role do civil society, academia, and independent media play in resisting authoritarian narratives? And how can European institutions more effectively protect and empower these actors in increasingly constrained political environments?
It is very difficult. I mentioned the media law in Hungary, which was one of the actions of the Orban government in 2010, because they knew exactly that controlling the media is the strongest power in their hands, somehow to brainwash people, to influence the sentiment in the country, changing the mind of the people very much. And we have been working also in the European Parliament on this issue, how much we can, from the European level, regulate or guarantee the freedom of the media. The problem is that in the countries where the media was really free, there was always a resistance saying that we don't need a EU level interference because we know how to do this. And it is the problem. If something is helpful for one of the countries, it might not be helpful for the other one. But I think how the EU can do this, it is supporting financially the independent media. And I think the independent media and the media in general is extremely important in that sense, helping people to understand that they live in a changing world. It means that they also personally have to take a responsibility, also personally have to adjust to this situation, because unless people understand this, it is very easy for the extreme right to say that we know what to do and we will protect you. Because in difficult times, people are much more willing to accept, let's say, strong leaders instead of democracy, because they might fear it's a psychological issue, and I'm a psychiatrist from my original profession. So in these difficult times, when people fear that they are in danger or they are losing something or they are outside risks, as we have now, they are much more willing to look for a strong leader, and charismatic personalities in this situation can very easily promise that I will protect you, which is not true at all. But but at the same time, it means that this type of strong leadership means that there's less and less democracy and more personal influence. And I think it's a very difficult and very dangerous track. And we see the signs of this track also inside of the EU.
Yeah, ma'am, looking ahead and also from your experience as former Hungarian foreign minister, how can Europe renew a shared sense of purpose and democratic identity while remaining firmly grounded in human rights, inclusion, and social solidarity in an increasingly fragmented world?
Uh, I think the only way is because basically uh, we were speaking quite a lot about this, what happens if these extreme right parties or the populist parties are elected in the individual countries. I think the only way is somehow to help people, uh, uh, constituencies, voters, whoever, to understand that they have personal responsibilities also, and helping them to understand that Europe, with this type of construction, with its democratic rules and human rights and so on, is still something which is guaranteeing much more for them, uh, a, a safe future than anything else. And I really think that looking at the United States, which was also considered the very strong democracy, uh, looking at the United States, what is happening there, uh, seeing how easy it is to undermine rule of law, human rights, democracy, whatever, the checks and balances of the institutions. I think it might be useful. I had the same experience with the Brexit. We know that the Brexit was also supported by the populists in the UK, and I was also visiting the UK at that time, and I know that many people saw the risks of the Brexit, but many were very enthusiastic. Okay, we will get rid of the guest workers or the migrants. We will get rid of every expenditures which is paid to the EU and so on. But it was also very clear that after the Brexit really happened, many people realized that it's a very risky way, and it was a real loss for the UK. And it was, I think, it for many countries which were also considering leaving the EU. It was a wake-up call. They saw it exactly that it is not such a rosy road. And now what we see that the UK is in many sense much closer to the EU than before, but they were always criticizing that they are contributing more than they gain and so on. So I think it's a little bit the same process with the US and with Donald Trump. Seeing what happens if people are relying on a strong leader, if people follow this type of trend, I think it might be a wake-up call also for the public in the EU, and I think the freedom media is important in that sense.
Yeah.
If people are informed, that I think it is helpful. Don't go to this road.
Yeah, I would like to conclude the discussion by asking that
Yeah.
in the current geopolitical scenario where you have tensions between Russia and Ukraine, where you have growing influence of China and tensions between Denmark and the United States over Greenland, where do you see European Union foreign policy going forward?
I think China is is ambivalent with the situation. We know that it is silently supporting Russia in many sense, but at the same time also keeping a certain distance. And because we are in a kind of reshuffling of the global world, I support very much the initiatives of the EU to look for new allies and new partners around the world, because the old ones, which were quite easy, let's say, we knew that the United States, the kind of ally, we are having the same values and so on. So I think it is very important that the EU seems to be open enough to look around for potential allies. And it's also important to have a kind of dialogue and negotiation with China, which is also looking for allies and looking for the new situation, who they can have a kind of safe trade exchange and so on. So I think what is important, not to be too slow, and it is one of the disadvantages of the EU, that the decisions are always very slow. In democracy, decisions are slow because you have to take into consideration all of the opinions. So I think what the EU can do really, being alert, looking around and seeing which parts of the world and which countries can be allies in this very difficult situation, because Russia is a direct threat for the EU. Ukraine is in between, and poor Ukrainians are fighting this fight now. But it is just the next step to go to the Baltic states. Is just the next step to go to Poland. The next step also to go to Hungary, and we know that for Putin it is not a taboo. Thinking about all of these countries which earlier were somehow in this region. So I think what the EU can do, being open and somehow look for new allies.
Yeah, and just a quick question, because European Union leaders are meeting their Indian counterparts this month as well. So how do you see the role of middle parts like India in this whole scenario?
The rule of what?
European Union leaders are meeting their Indian counterparts this month as well. So how do you see the role of middle parts like India in this whole scenario?
I think it is also an important role. I think it is part of this process very clearly.
Yeah. So, ma'am, as we conclude today's discussion, makes clear that defending democracy in Europe requires more than institutional safeguards. It demands a renewed commitment to human rights, rule of law, inclusion, and social trust at a time of growing uncertainty and polarization. Your reflections have highlighted that democratic resilience depends not only on policy but on empowering civil society and ensuring that democratic values remain meaningful in people's everyday life. Thank you very much, ma'am, once again for your time and insights. It's been a privilege to have you here on the Prode.
Thank you for the discussion. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, sir.